On December 6, 1991, a small Austin yogurt shop became the scene of one of the most disturbing crimes in Texas history. 4 teenage girls lost their lives, and decades later, the case still haunts America. The name of the store was I Can't Believe It's Yogurt. It was located in a strip center in Austin. It was a Friday night in early December, a typical hangout spot for teens. But by closing time, only a few people remained. The 4 victims were teenagers: Amy Ayers, 13, Eliza Thomas, 17, Jennifer Harbison, 17, and Sarah Harbison, 15. Jennifer and Eliza were employees of the yogurt shop. Sarah, Jennifer's younger sister, and Amy had come to the shop that night. They were waiting for a ride home with Jennifer after the store closed. About an hour before closing, they let a man use the restroom in the back of the shop. A couple who left shortly before 11 p.m. reported seeing 2 men sitting at a table. Around midnight, a policeman patrolling the area reported flames coming from the yogurt shop. When firefighters put out the blaze, they discovered the unthinkable. 4 nude bodies lay in the charred interior of the shop. The victims had been bound, gagged, and shot in the head, execution style. One girl, Amy Ayers, showed signs of having fought back. DNA under her fingernails would later prove critical to the investigation. The killer set the crime scene on fire. This destroyed much of the physical evidence that might have identified the killer. Investigators later determined that 2 different pistols, a .22 and .380, had been used. The arson, however, ruined much of the crime scene. Evidence was charred. Key surfaces were destroyed, and most of the DNA was erased. This made the case far harder to solve. It also opened the door for missteps in the investigation that would follow. These were daughters, sisters, friends. Families were left to grieve as Austin grappled with the horror of what had happened. The store was ordinary, a simple yogurt shop where teens hung out after school and on Friday nights. The community was stunned. Parents became worried, and the city demanded answers. In the first months, police followed hundreds of leads. They questioned former employees, ex-boyfriends, and anybody that was seen near the store that night. By 1992, the case had gone cold. Years passed. Detectives came and went. Then, in 1999, almost 8 years later, police made an announcement. 4 suspects had been arrested. The first break came from 16-year-old Maurice Pierce, who in 1991 had been caught with a .22 caliber pistol at a nearby mall, the same caliber used in the murders. Police questioned him, but released him at the time. Years later, detectives returned to that old tip, convinced that Pierce and his friends might have been involved. Pierce's name led them to Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, and Forrest Wellborn, all young men who were friends as teenagers. The police began a series of lengthy interrogations that would define the case. Michael Scott was the first to confess. He was 26 years old when detectives questioned him in 1999, 8 years after the crime. He initially denied any involvement, but after hours of pressure, isolation, and repeated questioning, his story began to break. Scott later said that officers screamed at him, slammed a gun on the table, and even pointed it at his head.
They told me if I didn't confess, I'd never see daylight again.
After Scott's confession, detectives turned to Robert Springsteen, using Scott's confession against him. They told Springsteen they already knew everything. They just needed his version of events. After a long night of questioning, Springsteen also broke. In 2001, Robert Springsteen was convicted and sentenced to death. A year later, Michael Scott received a life sentence. The other two men, Maurice Pierce and Forrest Wellborn, were not convicted. A grand jury refused to indict Wellborn, and charges against Pierce were eventually dropped in 2003. Families of the victims were torn. In 2009, advances in DNA testing changed everything. New tests on samples from the victims revealed male DNA that did not match any of the four men. The results pointed to an unknown assailant. The courts overturned the convictions of both Springsteen and Scott. After nearly a decade behind bars, they were released, and the case was once again unsolved. All four of the accused men were free. The confessions were now seen as coerced, false, and born from intense police pressure. Austin still had no answers for this horrible crime. No one had been held responsible for the brutal murder of four teenage girls. On December 23, 2010, police pulled over Maurice Pierce. After a foot pursuit, he pulled out a knife and stabbed one of the officers in the neck. He was shot and killed. Austin police admitted that over 50 people confessed to the yogurt shop murders, even serial killer Kenneth McDuff, on the day of his execution. He was ruled out, most likely confessing to try and get a stay of execution. In 1992, two Mexican nationals reportedly confessed while being tortured by Mexican authorities. The case files were eventually put up, but detectives never stopped working on it. Cold case investigators revisited every piece of evidence: the burned clothing, shell casings, and small amounts of DNA that survived the fire. They believed that with modern technology, even the smallest trace could tell the truth that the original investigators could not. In 2017, the Austin Police Department submitted preserved samples for retesting using newer methods that could analyze even degraded DNA. One of the profiles, a male DNA pattern, was entered into the national database. The DNA led to a name, Robert Eugene Brashers, a man already known by law enforcement. Brashers was a traveling criminal and a suspected serial rapist and murderer. He was active through the late 1980s and 1990s. He moved throughout several southern states: Missouri, Florida, Arkansas, Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, Texas, targeting women in their homes. He had a history of burglary, assault, and weapons charges. Investigators believed that in between his known crimes, Brashers may have passed through Austin. In 1999, the same year that Austin police were arresting the four innocent men, Brashers died by suicide after a standoff with Missouri police officers. Brashers held his family hostage and shot at police. After releasing his family, he took his own life. DNA recovered from his earlier crimes would later match the unknown male profiles from the Austin yogurt shop murders. When the match was confirmed, Austin investigators quietly reopened the file. The results were shocking. After nearly 30 years, the DNA that once cleared the wronged men now pointed directly to a man that was long deceased. But the evidence did not stop there. Brasher's movements in the early 90s placed him within driving distance of Austin. His known victims had been attacked in eerily similar ways: bound, gagged, sexually assaulted, and shot. At the time of the original murders, there was no national DNA database, and DNA was in its infancy. Brasher's operated in the shadows. He was in many ways invisible to Austin detectives in 1991. By the time forensics caught up with him, he was dead, taking his secrets to the grave. For the families, the findings brought relief and heartbreak. Relief that the truth had finally come to light, and heartbreak that justice would never be served. 4 young girls lost their lives. 4 innocent men lost years of their lives to false accusations. And 1 killer evaded justice. For years, the victims' families has sat through court hearings, retrials, and painful anniversaries, hoping for answers that never seemed to come. The wrongful convictions of Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott forced Texas and much of the U.S. to re-examine how interrogations were handled. Both men had confessed under extreme psychological pressure.
I was berated and berated and berated by the police officers. Until they obtained what it was they wanted to hear, they were not going to allow me to leave. And basically, they broke me down.
Their exoneration helped fuel an ongoing movement towards reform, requiring that investigations be recorded in full. The case became a textbook example in legal training of how false confessions can happen, even amongst adults with no prior criminal record. In '91, DNA testing was in its infancy. Decades later, preserved samples were reanalyzed using advanced techniques, the same science that would eventually identify Robert Eugene Brashers as a probable killer. Today, the state maintains a cold case unit dedicated to providing support to law enforcement agencies across the state. The site where the yogurt shop once stood is now another business, but people still come to remember the victims from that night. Despite the DNA match to Robert Eugene Brashers, the case technically remains open. Investigators say there's always a chance another person was involved, an accomplice who helped set the fire and cover up the crime. The Austin Yogurt Shop murders. It's been more than 30 years, and Austin still remembers those 4 young girls: Amy Ayers, Sarah Harbison, Jennifer Harbison, Eliza Thomas. I want to thank you all for watching, folks. I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you on the next.